Welcome to the second part of the SimpleBind introduction tutorial. In this video, we will extend the scene that was created in the first part by binding to a binding context, implementing two-way binding, and utilizing a basic single value converter. A binding context allows a single object to be set as the source for multiple bindings. The source value for the binding context can be set in the editor, from a script, or can be inherited from another binding context further up in the hierarchy. To start this demo, we will open the same scene from last time, switch back to the scene view, and we're going to add an empty game object and move it to the root. This game object will represent the core functionality of our application, the object that will expose the underlying models or view models to the view. Let's go ahead and rename the game object to Video2App. We need to create a new script on Video2App. Add component, new script, and we'll just name it the same thing, Video2App. At this point, go ahead and open up the script in whatever editor you are using. We won't need the start or update functions, so let's just go ahead and delete both of those. What we will want is another class that can represent the view model for our application. A view model is typically not a model behavior and may or may not have any Unity-specific implementation details. For this example, we'll create a simple new class and we'll call it ViewModel. The view model is going to need a single float value, and let's call it demo value. This will hold the value that we're going to bind to the different elements within our view. Finally, we'll need to add an instance of the view model to our Video2 app. Let's go ahead and create a public view model. Let's call it view model. And we're going to initialize it to a new instance of the view model. Go ahead and save the script. And let's switch back to Unity. The first update to the binding is to make the value from the slider update the view model demo value property when changed. There are multiple ways we could accomplish this, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we will use a binding context. We'll select the game object for the canvas. Let's go ahead and close these down. And we'll add a component, and this time we want to add a binding context. You'll notice that a binding context has a value source, which looks very similar to the source and target properties on the binding behavior. There's also three other non-settable properties. These are used for debugging purposes. They will show you the parent, whether or not this binding context is inheriting from that parent, and what the current value of the binding context is. In this case, we want to bind our binding context to our view model on the Video2 app. So let's drag our Video2 app down. Let's select the component Video2 app, and we're going to go ahead and select the view model. So now our view model is the source for the binding context. The next thing we want to do is select the slider component. We're also going to add a binding behavior. This time though, we want to bind to our canvas and the binding context. However, you will notice that since we're binding to a binding context, we don't have a drop-down for the properties. The binding context source could be changed dynamically at runtime, and therefore we don't necessarily know what the type of it is going to be. In this case though, we know the name of the property that we want, which is called demo value. The target in this case is the slider component, and the value property of that slider component. In this case though, we want the value of the slider to be sent back to the source, which is the demo value on the view model. So let's change the direction from source to target to source. And because we know the value is a float, and we also know that our demo value is a float, we don't need to use any converters. Let's go ahead and click back on our text object, and if you remember, we had a binding behavior set up that bound the slider to the text box. In this case though, let's go ahead and change this so that the source is no longer the slider, but the source is the binding context demo value. This means that whenever we update the slider will update the binding context, which is the view model. The view model will then change, causing the text to update. Let's go ahead and run this and see how it works. You'll notice that as I move it, my binding works just as it did before. Like I said, the difference is though, this time, the value is being passed through the view model. If we click back on our canvas, you will notice that our binding context does not have a parent. It is not inheriting, but the value is view model, which is what we would expect. The next thing we want to do is we want to implement some two-way binding and utilize a value converter. To do this, let's go ahead and add a UI input field, and let's place it right below the slider. In this case, what we want to do is we want to be able to type a value into this text box and have it represented in both the text field and also represented on the slider. We also want to be able to change the slider and have both the text and the input box updated as well. So let's see how we can do that. The first thing we want to do is on our input field, we want to add a binding behavior. And just like the slider and the text, we're going to bind that binding behavior to the binding context demo value. You also notice again that our target is automatically set to the input field text by default. In this case though, we want to go from the target to the source and also from the source to the target. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to select both. And in this case as well, our text is a text field or a string, and our demo value is a float value. So let's go ahead and select a converter of type float to string to make sure that our values get converted properly. The final thing we will do is we'll go ahead and change our content type to a decimal number, just so the input field can do some validation for us. Now let's go ahead and let's run the scene one more time. You'll notice that the value automatically went to 0. When I update my slider, you'll notice that both text fields and the text input are updated. What would happen if I typed into the text field, the input field? You'll notice that my text field is updating, but my slider is not. If you remember, our slider is still set to only target to source binding and not both or two-way binding. Let's go and stop the scene. Select our slider again, and let's go ahead and choose both. And in this case, we don't need to set a converter because both demo value and value are both floats. Let's go ahead and run the scene one more time. As I move the slider, my value updates in both locations. This time if I go ahead and I update my value, you'll notice that the slider also updated. So what exactly is going on? We have a two-way binding on the input box. As I type a new value into the input box, the value is bound to the canvas, to the binding context, which is view model. The value on the view model is updated, and when that updates, it pushes the new value through the binding to the text component, and also through the binding to the slider component. And the slider component also has a two-way binding. So as I move the value on the slider, it also pushes the value back through the binding context to the view model, which then again pushes the value back out to the other bindings, including the input field's two-way binding. That is a quick introduction to binding context, two-way bindings, and binding converters. Thank you for watching this Simple Bind tutorial.